Support for Carolina Business Review provided by Grant Thornton. Operating in more than 100 countries, our tax, audit, and advisory professionals specialize in helping companies unlock their growth potential. Blue Cross and Blue Shield of South Carolina, where healthcare is changing for the better. Find out how at ahealthysc.tv. And by Sunoco, a global manufacturer of consumer and industrial packaging products and provider of packaging services, with more than 300 operations in 35 countries.
Politics, policy, and social and economic development. The recent bill passed in the North Carolina General Assembly, what is referred to as the bathroom bill, has most certainly set off one of the most acute and vehement social debates in a long time, even by reality show standards. Welcome again. Thank you for supporting this program and dialogue for the last 25 years. I'm Chris William, and this acerbic nature of politics and public dialogue now, is it a sole result of this one-time legislative action, or is there a cumulative effect and a backlash here at work, at least in North Carolina? What is the economic impact of the Tar Heel commerce and communities in general, and ultimately to its arc and its growth and its place in the world? For somewhere that has been known to be progressive, is it still progressive in this New South? We'll start the discussion in a moment.
Major funding also by Novant Health, bringing you world-class technology, clinicians, and care when and where you need it. The Duke Endowment, a private foundation enriching communities in the Carolinas through higher education, healthcare, rural churches, and children's services. And by Blue Cross and Blue Shield of North Carolina. Who's responsible for rising healthcare costs? Join us and many others in a candid discussion at letstalkcost.com. On this edition of Carolina Business Review, Joe Stewart from the NC Free Enterprise Foundation, J. Mark Farris of the Greenville Area Development Corporation, and Mark C. Cramer of the Greater Gaston Development Corporation.
Hello, welcome to our program. Happy spring. Gentlemen, welcome back. Good to have you both, Marks, here. And Joe, welcome to this dialogue.
Thanks, Chris.
I almost don't know where to start with this. Mark, Farris, I'm looking at you.
Okay.
Voter registration, refugee laws, and this is not just North Carolina I'm talking about. Voter registration, refugee laws, bathroom bills. Are social debates taking over the more tangible debates around economic development and family help and transportation and education? How did we find ourselves in this debate?
You know, these tend to get blown out of proportion a lot. It's funny, this morning I had a group of Chinese businessmen in my office, and they never once asked me about things like this. They were more concerned about transportation, cost of electricity, and we tend to think that, you know, these are issues that really have a significant impact, but when in reality, businesses are interested in cost of operation. If you can lower cost of operation, then that's going to be more important to them. Now, it is, you know, significant to some companies, but on the whole, we hadn't seen a whole lot of backlash from it.
Yeah. Joe, Mark, jump in here. What do you think?
Well, it's partly a reflection of the demographics of the states. And our state, for instance, there's a lot of red area in the rural areas, and there's some blue areas in the metropolitan areas. And you have a different philosophical viewpoint on some of these major issues. And with the legislature split and the rural legislatures having some control, although I think in the last census, the urban areas just slightly overcame the rural in terms of total population, you have a different political viewpoint, and the state is split kind of down the middle, and this reflects that.
Yeah, and the state's gone through tremendous change. Now half of North Carolina is non-native, and the growth has been principally in the major metropolitan areas. Mecklenburg County and Wake County, Raleigh and Charlotte, the fastest growing parts of the state. Almost half of the total growth just since 2010 in those two counties. And the cities are starting to rise in their political influence. They have very different political sensitivities than the state as a whole. And despite the fact that after 2010, the Census Bureau said North Carolina, for the first time, is an urban state, more people in a city than not. But we have the largest portion of our state that is rural of any of the urban states. So a little bit of that conflict as part of the maturation of the state.
So I keep asking about cause and effect. I do want to come back to this. So how did we, keep going back to the root cause? Where did we find this incivility? Where did we find this lack of respect in the debate? Mark, how did this happen? How did the name calling become the way to get your point across? And where did the statesmen and the stateswomen go?
I think a lot of it is about politicians becoming performers. I think that gets a lot of press. It gets a lot of publicity. If you think about outrageous statements that are made, as opposed to really talking about the issues, that's boring. Nobody really wants to, to discuss that. The idea that I think a lot of politicians feel that they can appeal to, even if it's demographic blocks of people that they feel are going to support them, they're going to take the opportunity, unfortunately.
Well, you also have the issue of gerrymandering, and both parties do it nationwide.
Both states and both parties. This is not new.
So it's nothing new about it, but it does tend to create more radical politicians in that the primary is the whole game. And so you're appealing to your base to get elected, and the general election is not really an election because the district is drawn such that it's one party or the other that takes that seat. And so you get this polarization. That's what happens.
Well, and part of the dynamic too, just in our culture, so many more sources for information. We thought the internet would be this enormously liberating force in politics because people would have access to information they could get directly. But what's happened is people are separating away from any content they disagree with. And so they're only really hearing one point of view. Compromise is really based, in large part, on understanding the other person's point of view. And our culture is really not supporting that phenomenon like it once did.
Well, no one wants to run for public office. No one wants to put themselves through that. Voter turnout is pathetic in more cases than it's not. Thomas Jefferson, by the way, and this is just one of my favorite quotes. It's not like I'm a historic encyclopedia here, but Jefferson called that defective citizenship. Right. So we're being critical and not engaged at the same time. Joe, you just said something. You said now it's like that. Do you think this is the first wave of the great liberalization of the internet, or is this how our politics are going to go from now on?
Well, one of the interesting dynamics of the rise of millennials in American politics, a very large populational cohort, 87 million nationwide, most diverse, but a generation that's only ever known the internet. They've only had a 24-hour news cycle, but they tend to inform themselves on politics and public policy with each other, and they talk through social media. They have conversations, and so I think this next generation of American leaders and voters will have a very different disposition about this stuff. I'm very hopeful that that helps to reinform our politics on a more across-the-board basis and not so isolated as we seem to be now.
Mark, you look like you were going to say something.
It's very atomized in terms of people's communications. And the other thing that's an interesting outgrowth of this is a lot of communities are trying to attract the innovators, the job producers, the entrepreneurs, a lot of them millennials, a lot of them tech-oriented. And this specific issue that the southern states are fighting through, they are all on one side of that issue.
Yeah.
I mean, they are just all on one side of that issue. They can't understand why this is, and that's one reason I think a lot of these companies that have a lot of tech workers, PayPal, for instance, that they're responding to the people that work for them, saying this is outrageous. We can't go there.
Do you think, to your point, Mark, you talked about PayPal. Do you think that their very quick reaction at the beginning to say we have changed our mind on the reload in North Carolina, we're not going to North Carolina anymore, and clearly you're following through with that. Do you think there is more of that coming? Do you think not just necessarily the elephant that has decided not to join the tribe, so to speak, but do you think there are a lot of things like visitors bureaus, conventions have rethought the whole move to North Carolina?
I think that is happening, yes. I think you're reading about some of it in the paper, and there's others that are happening that you don't read about, that are under the surface, that they don't even consider us. You're off the list, and so that doesn't make news because you didn't know you got stricken from the list. So I think it's a serious issue and will carry forward for some time. I mean, it's a reputation, and that's sort of what we're talking about. The state's image, the state's reputation. It's taken 30, 40, 50 years to build the state's reputation as a progressive southern state. But it takes that long to build it, but it can turn upside down on you in a couple of months.
So, Mark, how much does the Palmetto State take advantage of North Carolina's woes, economic development?
Well, we certainly we don't want to cause any damage, any further damage. But if there's an opportunity that presents itself, I'm paid to bring jobs to Greenville County.
Right.
So at the end of the day, it's an inherently competitive business. Having said that, obviously we're professionals and we try to communicate with our peers across the two states when situations like that arise. But it's hadn't been the free-for-all that I believe everybody thinks it is. It's affected a few companies, but by and large, business is continuing as usual. Activity is wonderful. The kind of manufacturing companies that we're working with in Greenville and in South Carolina and North Carolina as well, they're still again concerned about the basics. They're probably wondering why we're dealing with issues like this as opposed to a roads bill. Why are we not focusing on infrastructure? And it is a good question, frankly.
Mm-hmm. Do you think North Carolina? I mean, you lived in not just the shadow of North Carolina, but you did business in North Carolina when you were in York County, and so you got a fairly well-informed opinion. Do you think North Carolina is going to get past this from the reputational standpoint?
Absolutely. I think all memories are short, but especially if it refocuses on the basics of providing value to companies who are looking in the area. Yeah, there are a few high-profile cases that's this impacting, but overall, I think again companies want to figure out how to lower cost operations. If we can prove value, labor is critical. Right. North Carolina's done a wonderful job of providing labor resources for the technology-intensive manufacturing companies. South Carolina's done a good job as well. But again, those things take precedent over issues like this. It gets a lot of attention that it's not deserved.
Joe, do the North Carolina Chamber, largest business organization like it, is taking a lot of heat. Lou Ebert has taken a lot of heat for not being vocal on this. Not asking you if you think he should. I'm asking you, not just the Chamber, but even some of the big operators like Duke Energy have been silent on this. Does that surprise you that the largest organizations like that have pushed back to say no comment?
Yeah, well, I was the political director at the State Chamber when Amendment 1 was on the ballot, the prohibition on same-sex marriages in North Carolina, and a lot of conversation about whether or not the State Chamber in North Carolina would take a position on that, and the decision was made. There were members on both sides, and so they would let each one of them speak for themselves and their own company. And I think to the extent that the State Chamber is a membership organization, it does necessarily need to be deferential when there's an issue where there's not a consensus. And so perhaps the Chamber is trying to be Solomon-esque in this and say, let individual companies make their voices heard. There's always a role in the advocacy arena to make a case for encouraging calmer heads to prevail and not to take immediate action and to be more thoughtful. But I think in this case, it's such a highly charged issue. It's not surprising that the Chamber has taken the position of letting companies speak for themselves and not trying to necessarily say the business community unilaterally feels one way or the other. At one point in my career, I was a lobbyist for insurance companies, automobile and homeowners insurance companies, and legislators would say to me, what does the insurance industry think of this? And I said, don't you watch TV? These guys hate each other. And so the sense that there's a monolithic business community position on any issue is elusive.
The New York Times had an op-ed and actually had an article, and it was talking about states trying to safeguard themselves from national cultural trends and federal mandates, and then municipalities within the states were trying to carve out their own place within the state. So if we see these silos, we see feds, how they feel, federal mandate, federal national culture, then we see states saying, no, we're going to control our own destiny. Then you see the cities within the state saying, yeah, we're not buying anything the General Assembly is, we're our own brand, which we're seeing now. Is this isolationist? Is that what's happening here?
I don't think it's isolationist. I think it's a function of finance. I mean, just to be blunt
in what way?
about
What
it.
does that mean?
So Jim Clifton wrote a book. It's called The Coming Jobs War, and it talked about the fact that the national politics are in gridlock. Our state capitals, Columbia and Raleigh, are not responding to things like infrastructure requirements, and at the city level, they're the ones doing the work. I mean, if you get anything done of a significance in your community, largely it's done by the municipalities. And so I think it's you can't wait on Columbia and Raleigh to do it anymore. You have to do it. And Greenville's a good example. So was York County in terms of the roads money that was passed for the construction. $600 million worth of new roads are being built there now. So if we're going to do anything, it's going to have to be done at the local level. And I think it's just a response to that fact.
Yeah, and let me ask you one quick thing. There's debate on a roads bill going on at the State House in Columbia right now. This could be a second year of the lack of a roads bill. That almost seems like political suicide if the Senate and the House don't deliver some type of roads relief. Would you expect that the State House is actually not going to have a roads bill?
I think we'll end up getting another Band-Aid. Area Development Magazine, interestingly enough, every year they come out with a survey, and they talk to hundreds of companies who either expanded or relocated to the area in the U.S., and they ask what were your most important criteria for locating in that community. And number one in 2015 was transportation, good access. So I think that kind of message might hopefully spur them to do something more proactive where that's concerned, because the most powerful comment that was made during the whole debate in South Carolina, a prominent CEO stood up and said, I'm not going to invest another dime in South Carolina until the roads are fixed. And so that really grabbed the attention, especially elected officials.
That was Michelin CEO, wasn't it?
It was, yes. Yeah.
And that's, they make tires. This is fairly meaningful in the roads bill.
Certainly, but I think the concept is the same. We've got to address the issues that are important to business.
That seems like an easier lift in South Carolina, but still with this House Bill 2 looming in North Carolina. Mark, do you think North Carolina will get the General Assembly that starts its short session here fairly soon? We're already into it by the airing of this program. Do you think they're going to get back to the business of commerce, development, more than social issues before the election in November?
Well, I hope they address the HB2 in some meaningful way. That the business community, if there's sort of a common refrain, it's the Charlotte Chamber's position, which is you guys need to figure out a way to work this out. That you need to go back and have the policy debate now about what's a reasonable way to address the question, see if you can at least reasonably satisfy both sides and come to some compromise position that doesn't harm the state and gets us out of this box we're in. That hopefully they can do that in this regard. Now, it's a little after the fact. I mean, there's positions are solidified, and the governor made a good move with his executive order. At least it will start some dialogue, hopefully. It isn't the complete answer, but it's the start of the dialogue. And so they need to get through that if they can. I think they will also, of course, focus on economic issues. I mean, they're pretty good about that. I mean, the whole question of the state income tax and the reductions of that, and looking at the different tax structure and incentives bills and the other things they accomplished in the last session, they'll continue to do that. So I'm confident of that. Yeah. You've got to get through this other issue as well, though.
Yeah, Joe, it does seem, pity's not the right word, but it does seem pitiful that that North Carolina has done some good things here that gets eclipsed by this social headline. Do you think that the social debate, the social feelings, the acrimony, you think that's going to hang on until the November election?
Well, I think it's important to note that it's April and that the election's in November. And so the likelihood of House Bill 2 being a significant election year issue probably is not as great. We'll see some action undoubtedly in the legislative session, and probably some other issues will come up. But the voter anger and frustration that's fomented in this particular election cycle is really been born out of a sense of economic uncertainty. The recovery has not been solid, and it's certainly not been sort of pervasive. A lot of people don't feel as confident that things are going to continue to be good. Quite frankly, in any election, it's the economy's stupid. I mean, it's still incumbents trying to prove to voters that they did the right things and that you should be hopeful and excited about the future and your economic well-being and your family's financial security. But candidates want to focus on that stuff. So social agenda issues, which have a tendency to drive base voters in the Republican and Democratic Party, but undecided voters in a competitive state like North Carolina, it's that very small percentage of the electorate that you really have to convince you're the right candidate in order to win. And they're going to be focused on other issues, economic issues, and it may well be national security issues because of the threat of terrorism that we face.
So notwithstanding presidential politics, do you think North Carolina, at least in the Tar Heel state, they'll get past the debate around the social issue and get back to the business at hand?
I suspect so.
You think?
I suspect so.
Sooner rather than later? Or think it could be drawn out?
Well, there are some significant divides even within the Republican Party. Controls both chambers of our state legislature and the governor's office. Within the Republican Party, some strong voices of social conservatism, and we see that manifest on some social issues being a part of the agenda. But in terms of fiscal policy, size and scope of government, the Republican legislators have a lot to talk about. They've reduced taxes, they've made the regulatory system better, and there's still more work to do in that regard. So I think the pressure will be within the Republican caucus, both House and Senate, for those voices that are fiscal conservatives, pro-business oriented legislators to say, let's get back to the stuff that makes us a desirable place for business and that will continue the growth patterns that make us a successful place.
Pat McCrory haters say there's no chance he's going to go down on this one by the November election. Pat McCrory supporters say he's been very smart to play to his very conservative Republican base. How do you come down on this? How much risk do you think he's at?
Well, to some extent, and it's very hard to tell at this point what the factors are in those final 30 crucial days before the election, but because such a significant part of North Carolina's electoral base is now from other parts of the country, the influence of the national dynamics of elections far more meaningful. The 2014 U.S. Senate race, Tom Tillis, the Republican candidate, started to do better once ISIS and Ebola became an issue, when national security concerns impacted voters principally in the suburban parts of North Carolina, and they started to focus more on those than they were on public education and domestic policy. So to some extent, probably the longest shadow to be cast across the statewide races in North Carolina in 2016 is the presidential contest, because voters will be very focused on that matchup, whomever it ends up being.
Yeah, Mark, in your area of dominant influence, in your part of the state of North Carolina, you come from a conservative base. How do you think McCrory's going to fare this year?
Yeah, I think it'll be a close, tight race, and he has a good shot at being reelected, but it'll be close.
Are you surprised at all by Roy Cooper, the opponent, who seems to be is going to be the crowned opponent for the Democratic side? Do you expect, and is, are you surprised that he hasn't been more aggressive or assertive on attacking the sitting governor on this?
I think he's been relatively aggressive.
You think so?
I think he's been out front on it, and I think his refusal as Attorney General to defend the law is a pretty aggressive stance by an Attorney General. And to say I have a policy disagreement, some of it's our structure as a state where we independently elect an Attorney General, and so he has a constituency to respond to as opposed to being appointed by the governor. But I think he's been relatively aggressive about it.
We've got a couple minutes left. Mark, what do you forget about the social issues, or maybe not, maybe that's your biggest concern, but what do you look at day to day, week to week, just from your personal point of view and also from your professional point of view, and you say, I am most concerned about X.
Labor.
Access to labor.
The skill sets. Joe talked about the recovery being slow. I think that's not really true. I think actually there's been a significant recovery, and people talk about it being a jobless recovery. That's not true either.
Right.
The jobs are there. They're just at a higher skill set requirement that we've done a poor job, and the nation as well, of training those folks to meet the demands of contemporary technology-based industry. I've got a company coming into Greenville. They'll have one machine that's $30 million.
Right.
So the requirements to operate that piece of machinery are way above what we've trained for in the past. So we're either going to have to meet that demand or we're going to lose. We win or lose projects now based on our ability to convince companies that we can supply the skill sets that they need for the jobs that are out there. The jobs are there. There's just a disconnect between the skill sets that we have of the employees now and the training that's going to be required for the future.
Single biggest worry, Mark, what do you think? For you, what's the single biggest concern?
Labor. I think that's the same problem in both states. That the matchup between the skill set you have and what the employers want and need, it's a difficult thing to do, and it's particularly difficult to say what jobs are going to be here in 5 years, and let's build a curriculum to prepare people for those jobs, or 10 years out. I mean, the ability to predict is very difficult. And to do it, and when you have educational institutions, they're government institutions, you got to develop curriculum, you've got to get it approved, you've got to, it takes a while to move those ships. And it's hard to be responsive. Everybody's working hard at it. And we're doing some great things in North Carolina, Gaston County. Our organizations are doing some great things, but it takes a lot of effort and a lot of focus.
Okay.
And you got to be lucky predicting what's coming.
And I don't want to cut you off. I'm sorry.
Yeah.
10 seconds. What are you most concerned about, Joe?
Well, it's the complexity of a global economy and helping legislators and other elected officials understand that we're not in competition with South Carolina. We're in competition to do business in Southeast Asia. And that just makes it a little more difficult than historically legislators have been able to understand.
Yeah. Thank you. Good job in squeezing that one in the very last seconds of the program, Joe. Thank you. Mark, nice to see you again. Mark, welcome back. Thank you. Thank you for watching our program. If you have any questions or comments, and we certainly hope you will, go to carolinabusinessreview.org and make your comment. Until next week, I'm Chris. Good night.
Major funding for Carolina Business Review was provided by the Duke Endowment, a private foundation enriching communities in the Carolinas through higher education, healthcare, rural churches, and children's services. Blue Cross and Blue Shield of North Carolina. Who's responsible for rising healthcare costs? Join us and many others in a candid discussion at letstalkcost.com. Grant Thornton, operating in more than 100 countries, our tax, audit, and advisory professionals specialize in helping companies unlock their growth potential. Novant Health, bringing you world-class technology, clinicians, and care, when and where you need it. Sunoco, a global manufacturer of consumer and industrial packaging products and provider of packaging services, with more than 300 operations in 35 countries. Blue Cross and Blue Shield of South Carolina, where healthcare is changing for the better. Find out how at ahealthysc.tv. And by viewers like you. Thank you. Promotional consideration provided by Business North Carolina Magazine. For more information, visit carolinabusinessreview.org.